Ladies and gentlemen, let's raise a toast to my daughter Bella, the bride who should have lost 20 pounds before wearing that dress. The crystal champagne glass slipped from my fingers, shattering against the marble floor of the reception hall. 200 guests fell silent as my mother's words echoed through the speakers, her voice, amplified by the microphone she'd snatched from the best man, hung in the air like poison. My perfect day crumbled before my eyes as laughter rippled through the crowd. My name is Bella Royce, and I'm 28 years old. I'd spent my entire life trying to please my mother, Diana Royce, the former beauty queen with impossible standards. Standing there in my custom-designed wedding gown, the one I'd saved for 18 months to afford, I watched my mother's crimson lips curl into that familiar smile, the one that said, "I'm just being honest, darling." Next to her stood my younger sister, Cassandra, barely concealing her smirk behind a champagne flute. The golden child, the perfect size, too, the daughter my mother had always wanted. "And while we're at it," my mother continued, her diamond bracelet catching the light as she gestured dramatically, "let's thank the seamstress who performed an absolute miracle with all that extra fabric." More laughter, more humiliation. My new husband, James, squeezed my hand under the table. His jaw was clenched so tight I could see a muscle twitching. "We should leave," he whispered. But I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't tear my eyes away from the train wreck unfolding before me. Growing up as Diana Royce's daughter meant living under a microscope. Every calorie counted, every flaw magnified. My sister had inherited our mother's metabolism and her cutting tongue. Together, they were an alliance I could never penetrate. When I announced my engagement, I foolishly believed things would change, that my happiness might matter more than my dress size. "Remember her sweet 16?" my sister chimed in, grabbing the microphone. "The baker confused the order and made a whale instead of a sailboat." She doubled over with theatrical laughter. It wasn't true. It had never happened. She was fabricating humiliations for an audience, all too willing to consume them. I felt 200 pairs of eyes burning into me, my future in-laws, my colleagues, friends who shifted uncomfortably in their seats, the videographer capturing every second of my devastation, the wedding planner hovering nearby, unsure whether to intervene. James stood suddenly, his chair scraping against the floor. "That's enough," he announced, but my mother spoke over him. "Oh, lighten up, son. Don't tell me you didn't notice what you were getting." She gestured at me with her glass. "We Royce women tell it like it is. Bella knows we love her, just more of her to love." The room was divided now, uncomfortable silence from some tables, open laughter from others. That's when something inside me snapped, not in the dramatic way you might think. No screaming, no scene. Instead, a cold, clear certainty washed over me. I'd spent my life accepting their cruelty as concern, their insults as honesty. I'd believed I deserved it, no more. I stood slowly, gathering the layers of my beautiful dress. Without a word, I walked to my mother and sister. Their smiles faltered as I approached. With perfect composure, I took the microphone. "Thank you, Mother, for that heartfelt toast," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. "You've always had a gift for making special moments unforgettable." The tension in the room was electric. Everyone waited for tears, for a scene. Instead, I smiled. "The reception will continue while my husband and I step out briefly. Please, enjoy the dinner you've all been served." As I handed the microphone to the stunned wedding planner, I leaned close to my mother's ear. "You have no idea what you've just done," I whispered, "but I promise you're about to find out." Her expression flickered with something I'd never seen before. Uncertainty. Perhaps even fear. Good. It was time she felt what I'd lived with my entire life. James and I walked out hand in hand as murmurs erupted behind us. In the quiet of the hallway, he turned to me. Are you okay? What do you want to do? I looked into his eyes, the cold clarity inside me crystallizing into resolve. I want to enjoy our wedding night. And tomorrow, I smiled, feeling a power I'd never known before. Tomorrow, I start making them regret every single word. The morning after my wedding, I woke up with a clarity I'd never experienced before. James was still asleep beside me, his arm protectively draped over my waist. I slipped out from under his embrace and padded to the hotel suite's window, watching the sunrise paint the sky in hues of pink and gold. My wedding day, the day I'd dreamed about since childhood, had been twisted into a nightmare. But oddly, I felt calm, focused. My phone buzzed on the nightstand, 17 missed calls from my mother, 23 text messages from Cassandra. I scrolled through them without emotion. You're being dramatic. It was just a joke. You've always been so sensitive. The guests were uncomfortable with how you left. The last one made me laugh out loud. They were uncomfortable? I set the phone down without responding and opened my laptop. The first phase of my plan required information, and as a data analyst for one of the country's largest financial institutions, information was my specialty. What my mother and sister didn't know was that their entire lives were built on carefully constructed lies. My mother's old money status? A fabrication. Her celebrated charity foundation? A tax shelter. And Cassandra's perfect marriage to her surgeon husband? A convenient arrangement hiding his numerous indiscretions. I had suspected these things for years, but had never been motivated to confirm them. Now I had purpose. By the time James awoke, I had already created 3 separate spreadsheets and a timeline. He brought me coffee and sat beside me, his eyes serious. "Are you sure about this?" he asked quietly. "We could just cut them off completely, start fresh." I took his hand and kissed it. For 28 years, I've let them define me, control me, diminish me. Not anymore. I turned the laptop to show him. This isn't just about revenge, James. It's about justice. He studied the screen, then looked at me with new understanding. "What do you need from me?" "Just your support," I said, "and maybe your cousin who works for the IRS." That afternoon, we skipped our scheduled brunch with the wedding guests. Instead, we met with James's cousin, Michael, at a quiet cafe 3 towns over. Michael wasn't just any IRS employee. He specialized in high net worth tax evasion cases. "What you're describing," he said after I laid out my suspicions about my mother's foundation, "would be classified as charitable organization fraud. If true, the penalties are severe." "I need proof," I said. "Concrete evidence." Michael slid a business card across the table. "This colleague of mine handles forensic accounting. Everything stays confidential until you decide what to do with the information." Phase 1 was in motion. For our honeymoon, James and I had planned a 2-week trip to Greece. We decided to go as scheduled. It would give me space to think and plan while maintaining appearances. My mother and sister would assume I was sulking, licking my wounds. They had no idea I was methodically laying groundwork. On our 3rd day in Santorini, as we sipped wine on our private terrace overlooking the caldera, my phone rang. It was Eliza Hammond, the forensic accountant Michael had recommended. "Mrs. Royce Keller," she said, using my new married name, "I've completed the preliminary analysis of your mother's foundation. There are irregularities you should be aware of." I put the phone on speaker so James could hear. "What kind of irregularities?" "In the past 5 years, over $3 million have been diverted from the foundation to private accounts. The reported charitable activities appear to be largely fabricated. There are shell companies, inflated administrative expenses, and several potential instances of donor fraud." My hand was steady as I took notes. "And my sister's involvement?" She's listed as the foundation's secretary and has signatory authority on several of the questionable transfers. Whether she's an active participant or just a useful signature, I can't say. I thanked Eliza and promised to call her when we returned to the States. As I hung up, James watched me carefully. "What are you thinking?" he asked. I gazed out at the brilliant blue sea. "I'm thinking that the Royce family reputation is about to undergo a significant correction." The rest of our honeymoon passed in a blur of beautiful landscapes and strategic planning. I was different now, more decisive, more focused. James noticed it too. "You've changed," he said one night as we lay in bed. "For the better?" I asked. He traced my face with his fingertips. "You're stronger, like you finally recognized your own power." He was right. For the first time in my life, I wasn't seeking approval or validation. The constant voice in my head, the one that sounded suspiciously like my mother, had fallen silent. When we returned home, there was a handwritten note from my mother in our mailbox. "Darling," it read, "I hope you've gotten over your little tantrum. We simply must discuss the thank you notes for the wedding gifts. The longer you wait, the more etiquette is breached." I placed the note in a folder labeled Evidence and picked up the phone. It was time for phase 2. "Mother," I said when she answered, "I've been thinking about what happened at the wedding." "Oh, darling, finally. I was beginning to think you'd never—" "I'd like to meet with you and Cassandra," I interrupted, "to discuss the future of the Royce Family Foundation." There was a pause. "The foundation? But you've never shown any interest in—" "Tomorrow, your house, 2:00. I hung up before she could respond. James looked up from the book he was reading. "You didn't give her a chance to say no." I smiled. "She won't. She can't resist an opportunity to lecture me about family responsibility. Besides," I added, sliding onto the couch beside him, "she has no idea what I know." That night, I slept better than I had in years. Tomorrow, the scales would begin to balance. Tomorrow, Diana and Cassandra Royce would learn that their perfect victim had finally learned how to fight back, and they would never see it coming. At precisely 2:00 the next day, I rang the doorbell of my childhood home. The sprawling colonial that had once intimidated me now seemed smaller, less imposing. I adjusted my fitted navy blazer and straightened my shoulders. For the first time, I was entering this house on my own terms. My mother opened the door herself, unusual, as she typically had her housekeeper handle such mundane tasks. Her eyes swept over me critically, but I didn't flinch under her gaze. Those days were over. "Bella," she said, her voice sticky with false sweetness, "you look professional." I stepped past her into the marble foyer. "Is Cassandra here?" "In the sunroom. She's been so worried about you." My mother's hand fluttered to her throat, where her signature pearl necklace gleamed. "We both have." I said nothing, simply walked toward the sunroom where I knew my sister would be arranged like a decorative object, perfectly poised for maximum impact. And there she was, legs crossed at the ankles, hair swept into an elegant chignon, scrolling through her phone with manicured fingers. "The prodigal sister returned, madame," Cassandra drawled without looking up. "Done with your honeymoon tantrum?" I set my leather portfolio on the glass coffee table with a decisive thud. The sound made both of them jump. "Let's skip the pretense," I said. "I'm not here for reconciliation." My mother's face hardened as she took a seat across from me. "Then why are you here? The foundation is hardly your concern." I opened the portfolio and removed a stack of documents, sliding them across the table. $3 million, I said, diverted from charitable donations to private accounts in the Cayman Islands, falsified tax records, inflated administrative expenses. Shall I continue? The color drained from my mother's face. Beside her, Cassandra's phone slipped from her fingers, clattering onto the table. "You've been investigating us?" my sister hissed. "Daya, your own family?" "Family?" I laughed, the sound echoing in the sunroom. "Is that what you call it? Was it family when you humiliated me in front of everyone I care about? When you made my wedding day about my body instead of my happiness?" My mother recovered quickly, her shock morphing into calculated composure. "Whatever you think you found is easily explained. Our accountants—" "Your accountants are excellent at hiding money," I interrupted. "But they missed some details. Details that someone with my professional background wouldn't overlook." I pulled out another document, a list of the foundation's supposed charitable activities. The homeless shelter in Detroit that received $500,000? It doesn't exist. The medical supplies sent to Guatemala never arrived. The scholarship fund for underprivileged youth, empty. My mother's eyes narrowed. "What exactly do you want, Bella?" I leaned forward. Control of the foundation, its assets, and its future direction. Cassandra laughed, but it sounded hollow. "You? Run the foundation." "Don't be absurd. Your alternative is an IRS investigation," I said calmly. "Federal charges, public disgrace, prison time." The room fell silent except for the ticking of the antique grandfather clock in the corner, the same clock that had counted down the minutes of my childhood punishments. "You wouldn't dare," my mother whispered. "The scandal would destroy the Royce name." "The name you've been so proud of? The reputation you valued above your own daughter?" I stood, gathering my documents. "I'm giving you 24 hours to decide. Sign over control of the foundation, or I take everything I have to the authorities." As I turned to leave, Cassandra grabbed my arm. "You can't do this. Do you have any idea what this would do to my life? To my children?" I looked at her perfectly manicured hand on my arm, then into her eyes. "You should have thought about consequences before you took that microphone." I left them sitting there, surrounded by the evidence of their fraudulent lives. As I walked to my car, my phone buzzed with a text from James. "How did it go?" I smiled as I typed back. "Phase 2 complete. They're rattled." That evening, as James and I sat on our patio with glasses of wine, my phone rang. It was my mother. "We need to discuss terms," she said without preamble. "I'm listening. We'll transfer control of the foundation to you, but we want immunity. Written guarantees that you won't pursue legal action." I took a sip of wine. "That's part of it, but there's more." "More?" Her voice rose an octave. "What more could you possibly want?" "Public apologies," I said, "from both of you, at the Foundation's annual gala next month." The silence on the other end was deafening. The annual gala was the social event of the season, attended by everyone who was anyone in our city. It was my mother's crowning achievement each year, her chance to reign supreme over the social hierarchy she'd clawed her way into. "That's not possible," she finally said. "Then we have nothing more to discuss." I moved to hang up. "Wait!" The desperation in her voice was something I'd never heard before. "Fine, we'll do it. But the foundation? You'll keep it running? Maintain the Royce name?" "The foundation will continue," I assured her, though perhaps with a different focus than exotic tax shelters. The next morning, I met with my mother's attorney, a nervous man who kept dabbing at his forehead with a monogrammed handkerchief. He slid the transfer documents across his desk, pointing out where signatures were needed. "Mrs. Royce Keller," he said, using my married name with obvious discomfort, "are you certain this is what you want? The foundation has been your mother's life's work." I signed the last page with a flourish. "Her life's work has been maintaining appearances, Mr. Grayson. The foundation was just a means to that end." As I left his office, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. Phase 2 was complete. In my hand, I held control of the Royce Family Foundation, and with it, the power to reshape my mother's legacy. Phase 3 would begin at the gala, the event where my mother and sister would have to publicly acknowledge their cruelty, where the whispers and sidelong glances would be directed at them instead of me. I had 1 month to prepare. 1 month to ensure that when Diana and Cassandra Royce took the stage to apologize, everyone who mattered would be watching. And watching they would be, because if there was one thing I'd learned from my mother, it was how to create a spectacle. In the weeks leading up to the gala, I immersed myself in the foundation's records. What I discovered was even worse than I'd initially thought. The corruption ran deeper, stretching back nearly a decade. My mother hadn't just been skimming from the foundation. She'd been using it as her personal piggy bank, funding everything from Cassandra's 3 destination weddings to their monthly spa retreats in Switzerland. I worked late into the night, creating spreadsheets, tracking money flows, and documenting every questionable transaction. James would often find me at 3 a.m, still hunched over my laptop. "You need to rest," he'd say, massaging my shoulders. "You've got them cornered already." But this wasn't just about cornering them anymore. This was about understanding the full scope of their deceit, so I could dismantle it properly. 10 days before the gala, I received an unexpected visitor at my office. Cassandra, looking uncharacteristically disheveled, barged past my assistant and closed the door behind her. "We need to talk," she said. Dropping into the chair across from my desk, I continued typing, not bothering to look up. "I'm busy." "Bella, please." Something in her voice made me pause. "Mom is falling apart. She hasn't left her room in 3 days." I finally looked at her. The perfect Cassandra wasn't so perfect today. Her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, her face free of makeup, revealing dark circles under her eyes. "That sounds like a personal problem," I said. Cassandra leaned forward. "Look, I know we've been terrible to you. I know that now. But Mom, she can't handle this public humiliation. It will destroy her." "The way she tried to destroy me?" I closed my laptop. "The way both of you have been chipping away at my self-worth since I was a child?" "We were wrong," Cassandra whispered. "I was wrong, but please reconsider the public apology. Ask for anything else." I studied my sister, searching for the manipulation behind her words, but for once she seemed genuine, desperate even. "Anything else?" I repeated. "Like what?" "Money, property, cut us out of your life completely. Just don't make us do this." I almost laughed. "Do you really think this is about money or property? This is about accountability, Cassandra, about facing consequences for your actions." "But the gala is in 10 days, I cut her off. "I suggest you both start preparing your remarks." After she left, I sat in silence, turning our conversation over in my mind. It was the first time in my life I'd seen Cassandra vulnerable. The first time she'd admitted wrongdoing. It should have felt satisfying, but instead, I felt hollow. That night, I shared the encounter with James over dinner. "Are you having second thoughts?" he asked, studying my face. I pushed my food around my plate. "Not exactly, but seeing Cassandra like that, it was strange, like seeing behind the curtain for the first time." James reached across the table for my hand. "You know, revenge changes people. Sometimes the person it changes most is the one seeking it." His words stayed with me as I lay awake that night. Was I becoming like them? Calculating, cold, willing to inflict pain? The thought disturbed me enough that I called my therapist the next morning and scheduled an emergency session. Dr. Winters listened patiently as I explained everything: the wedding, the discovery of the foundation's fraud, my ultimatum, and now my doubts. It sounds like you're wrestling with the difference between justice and vengeance, she said when I finished. They can look very similar, but they come from different places and lead to different outcomes. How do I know which one I'm pursuing? I asked. Ask yourself, what do you hope to achieve? Is it primarily to cause pain or to create change? I considered her question carefully. I want them to feel what I felt, but I also want them to understand what they did wrong, to acknowledge it. Dr. Winters nodded. That's a start, but here's another question. After the gala, after the public apology, what then? What kind of relationship do you want with your mother and sister moving forward? I hadn't thought that far ahead. My focus had been so fixed on the gala, on that moment of public reckoning, that I hadn't considered what would come after. The week before the gala, I threw myself into foundation work. I hired a legitimate accounting firm to audit the books and consulted with nonprofit experts about restructuring the organization. If I was going to take control, I was determined to do it right. 3 days before the event, I received formal confirmation that my mother and sister would attend. The email was from my mother's assistant, cold, professional, devoid of any personal touch. I forwarded it to the event planner, specifying that Diana and Cassandra Royce would deliver brief remarks during the evening's program. The night before the gala, I couldn't sleep. I stood at our bedroom window, looking out at the city lights, when James joined me. You don't have to go through with this, he said softly. We could still walk away. I leaned against him. If I walk away, nothing changes. They continue being who they've always been, hurting people, manipulating situations to their advantage. And if you go through with it, what changes then? I turned to face him. I do. I stop being their victim. I stop letting them define me. James kissed my forehead. Then let's make sure tomorrow is everything you need it to be. The day of the gala dawned bright and clear. I spent hours getting ready, choosing a dress that was both elegant and powerful, a deep emerald sheath that highlighted my curves instead of hiding them. For the first time in my life, I wasn't trying to make myself smaller to please my mother. As we pulled up to the Grand Hotel where the gala was being held, James squeezed my hand. Remember, whatever happens in there, I'm with you. I took a deep breath and stepped out of the car. The venue was already buzzing with the city's elite, business leaders, politicians, old money families who had known my mother for decades. They watched with curious eyes as I entered, no doubt wondering about the rumors that had been circulating since my wedding. And then I saw them, my mother and sister, standing near the entrance to the ballroom. My mother's face was a mask of composure, but I could see the tension in her shoulders. Beside her, Cassandra looked like she might be sick. It was time for the final act of my carefully orchestrated revenge to begin. I approached my mother and sister with measured steps, conscious of the eyes following my movement across the marble floor. The emerald dress I'd chosen moved with me, a statement rather than an apology. As I drew closer, I noticed my mother's sharp intake of breath, surprise, perhaps, that I hadn't hidden myself in black or chosen something suitably slimming. Bella, she said, her voice low and controlled, you look unexpected. I smiled, feeling a strange calm settle over me. Good evening, Mother. Cassandra. Everything is arranged for your remarks. You'll be speaking after the main course. Cassandra's eyes darted nervously around the room. How many people are here? 317, I replied, including Senator Mitchell, the governor, and the board of trustees from Mercy Hospital. Oh, and several journalists. The foundation's work is quite newsworthy, after all. My mother's perfectly manicured hand tightened around her clutch. Journalists? Of course. I've been very transparent about the foundation's restructuring. Before she could respond, the event planner appeared at my elbow, tablet in hand. Mrs. Royce Keller, we're ready for you to take your seat. As the foundation's new director, you'll be at the head table. I watched my mother flinch at the sound of my new title. For decades, she had been the unquestioned queen of this event, the one who made seating charts, who decided which socialites were worthy of her inner circle. Now she was just another guest at a gala she no longer controlled. "We'll speak later," I said, turning away. "Enjoy the dinner." James was waiting for me near the entrance to the grand ballroom, handsome in his tailored suit. He offered his arm, and together we walked to the head table, where the foundation's major donors were already being seated. "How are you feeling?" he whispered. "Powerful," I answered honestly, and it was true. For the first time in my life, I wasn't seeking approval or validation from Diana Royce. I was standing entirely on my own. Dinner progressed with the practiced elegance of high society affairs. Between courses, I circulated among the tables, introducing myself as the foundation's new director, sharing my vision for its future. I was articulate, engaged, confident, everything my mother had always claimed I wasn't. From across the room, I could see her watching me, her expression a complex mixture of emotions I couldn't quite decipher. Beside her, Cassandra seemed to shrink with each passing hour, nursing a glass of champagne that never emptied. Finally, as dessert was being cleared, the moment arrived. The event planner approached the podium and tapped the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a special presentation this evening. I'd like to invite Mrs. Diana Royce and Ms. Cassandra Royce to the stage." A polite applause filled the room as my mother and sister made their way forward. My mother walked with her trademark poise, chin lifted, shoulders back. But Cassandra trailed behind, looking like she might bolt for the exit at any moment. "Be strong," James murmured, his hand finding mine under the table. The spotlight found my mother at the podium, illuminating the pearls at her throat and the strain at the corners of her smile. "Good evening," she began, her voice carrying through the room with practiced ease. "For 20 years, the Royce Family Foundation has been my greatest pride. Tonight, however, marks a new chapter." She paused, glancing down at the notes she'd prepared. When she looked up again, something in her expression had shifted. "I've been asked to make an apology tonight, a public acknowledgement of a private failing." Her voice wavered slightly. "At my daughter Bella's wedding, I said things that were cruel, unforgivable things, disguised as humor but designed to hurt." A murmur rippled through the crowd. This was not what they had expected from Diana Royce, the woman known for her unyielding perfectionism. "I've spent a lifetime imposing impossible standards," she continued, "on myself, on my daughters, particularly on Bella, who has shown more strength and resilience than I ever gave her credit for." I felt my breath catch. These weren't the rehearsed, superficial words I'd anticipated. There was something raw in her delivery, something unscripted. My actions at the wedding were inexcusable, but they were also a culmination of years of similar behavior, years of making Bella feel less than, years of valuing appearance over character, years of failing as a mother. A tear slipped down her cheek, something I had never seen in my 28 years of life. Diana Royce did not cry, not when my father left, not at funerals, not ever. "I don't expect forgiveness," she said, looking directly at me now. "But I want everyone in this room to know that the woman my daughter has become, strong, principled, uncompromising, she became that despite me, not because of me." She stepped back from the microphone, making room for Cassandra. My sister approached slowly, her hands visibly trembling. "I don't have my mother's gift for public speaking," she began softly, "but I do have her gift for cruelty, it seems." Another ripple through the audience. "Bella and we were never allies. We were competitors in a game I didn't realize was destroying both of us. Cassandra's voice broke. At her wedding, I joined in humiliating her because that's what we did. That's who we were. It was familiar, safe. She looked out at the crowd, then back at me. I've spent my whole life being the pretty one, the perfect one. It defined me. And to keep that definition intact, I needed Bella to be less. I needed her to stay in the box I helped create for her. Cassandra wiped at her eyes, but she's broken out of that box, and in doing so, she's shown me how small my life has been, how empty. I felt tears welling in my own eyes now. This wasn't the scripted humiliation I had planned. This was something else entirely. I'm sorry, Bella, Cassandra said, no longer addressing the crowd, but speaking directly to me. I'm sorry for the wedding, for the years before it, for everything. As she stepped away from the podium, a silence fell over the room. I felt hundreds of eyes on me, waiting for my reaction. This was my moment of triumph. My mother and sister laid bare before the very society they'd worked so hard to impress. But triumph felt hollow now. What I'd just witnessed wasn't two women reading forced apologies under duress. It was a genuine reckoning, painful, messy, and profoundly human. The event planner looked at me uncertainly, clearly wondering if I would speak next. I stood, smoothing my dress, and made my way to the podium. My mother and sister stepped aside, neither quite meeting my eyes. As I faced the crowded ballroom, I realized that the speech I'd prepared no longer felt right. The scorching words, the final twists of the knife, they belonged to a different version of me, a version still defined by pain and anger. I took a deep breath and began to speak. For those who don't know me, I began, my voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm me. My name is Bella Royce Keller. Until recently, I was known primarily as Diana's daughter, Cassandra's sister, always defined in relation to someone else. The room was absolutely silent, 317 people hanging on my every word. I came here tonight with a plan, I continued, a carefully orchestrated moment of public retribution. I wanted my mother and sister to feel what I felt at my wedding. Exposed, humiliated, diminished. I paused, looking directly at them standing to the side of the stage. My mother's face was pale, her usual mask of composure fractured. Cassandra's eyes were red-rimmed, vulnerable in a way I'd never seen before. For 28 years, I believed that I deserved their criticism, that if I could just lose enough weight, say the right things, become someone else entirely, then perhaps I would be worthy of their love. My voice remained strong, even as I revealed my deepest insecurities to a room full of strangers. What I didn't understand until recently was that their treatment of me was never about my worthiness. It was about their own insecurities, their own damaged relationships with themselves. A murmur rippled through the crowd. These were people who had orbited my mother's social circle for decades, who had witnessed her calculated charm and precise cruelty, but never named it. The Royce Family Foundation was meant to be about helping others, but like many things in the Royce family, it became corrupted by appearances, by the need to seem rather than to be. As the foundation's new director, I am announcing tonight a complete restructuring, full transparency, real charitable work, and a new name. I smiled slightly. The Phoenix Foundation, because sometimes something beautiful can rise from the ashes of something broken. Scattered applause broke out, hesitant at first, then growing. But I'm also here to say something else. I looked directly at my mother and sister, something I didn't plan to say tonight. The room held its collective breath. I accept your apologies. The words hung in the air, simple but profound. I watched my mother's hand fly to her mouth, watch Cassandra's shoulders sag with relief. Not because what you did was excusable. It wasn't. Not because words can erase years of damage. They can't. I took a deep breath. But because holding on to this anger is keeping me tethered to the person I used to be, the person who believed she deserved to be treated that way. I stepped away from the podium, then paused and returned to the microphone. One more thing. To anyone who laughed that day at my wedding, who watched a woman being publicly humiliated and found it amusing, I hope you'll reflect on that choice, because we all have the power to be complicit in cruelty or to stand against it. With that, I walked off the stage. James was waiting for me, his eyes shining with pride. As he wrapped his arms around me, I felt lighter somehow, as if I'd set down a burden I'd been carrying for too long. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. Donors approached me, expressing support for the foundation's new direction. Several women, some I barely knew, whispered their own stories of Diana Royce's cutting remarks over the years. I listened, nodded, but didn't feed the gossip. That cycle, at least, I could choose to break. It was nearly midnight when I found myself alone on the balcony overlooking the hotel gardens. Bella. I turned to find my mother standing in the doorway, hesitant in a way I'd never seen before. May I join you? I nodded. She came to stand beside me, both of us silent for a long moment. Your speech, she finally said. It wasn't what I expected. No, I agreed. It wasn't what I expected either. She gripped the balcony railing, her knuckles white. I meant what I said in there, about being proud of the woman you've become, about failing you. I studied her profile, the perfect posture, the carefully maintained appearance that had always been her armor. But there were cracks in that armor now, visible in the tremor of her hands, the uncertainty in her eyes. I know, I said simply. When you were born, she said softly, I promised myself I would never treat you the way my mother treated me. That history wouldn't repeat itself. She laughed bitterly. And yet, here we are. For the first time, I felt a flicker of curiosity about the grandmother I'd barely known. What was she like, your mother? Diana's grip on the railing tightened. Brutal. Nothing was ever good enough. Not my grades, not my appearance, certainly not my dreams. She turned to me, her eyes haunted. Sound familiar? I nodded slowly, seeing my mother, really seeing her, perhaps for the first time. That doesn't excuse what I did to you, she continued. Nothing could. But I want you to know I understand now what I've done, who I've been. Inside the ballroom, the band was playing the last song of the evening. The sweet, melancholy notes drifted out to where we stood. The foundation, my mother said after another silence. Your plans for it, they're good, Bella. Better than anything I ever did with it. Coming from Diana Royce, this was the highest praise imaginable. Thank you, I said simply. She hesitated, then reached into her clutch and pulled out a small velvet box. I was going to give this to Cassandra someday. My mother gave it to me when I turned 30. It's been in our family for generations. She opened the box to reveal an antique diamond brooch, the one I had admired as a child but never been allowed to touch. I'd like you to have it, if you want it. I looked at the glittering piece, then back at my mother. Why now? Because you're the strongest Royce woman I've ever known, she said, her voice breaking. Stronger than me, stronger than my mother. You broke the cycle that I couldn't. I took the box, feeling the weight of it in my palm, the weight of history, of pain, but also of possibility. This doesn't fix everything, I said quietly. You know that, right? She nodded. I know, but maybe it's a place to start. As we stood there together, neither quite ready to bridge the physical distance between us, but something shifting nonetheless, I realized that revenge had never been what I truly wanted. What I had been seeking all along was simply to be seen, to be acknowledged, to matter. And in this moment, on this balcony, with the night stretched out before us and years of pain finally spoken aloud, I did. 6 months after the gala, I sat in my office at the Phoenix Foundation, reviewing grant applications for our new initiative supporting body positivity programs in schools. The foundation had been completely transformed, transparent financials, meaningful projects, and a board comprised of experts rather than my mother's social circle. A knock at my door interrupted my thoughts. Cassandra stood there, looking different than I remembered, softer somehow, in jeans and a simple blouse instead of her usual designer attire. "The quarterly meeting is about to start," she reminded me. "Everyone's waiting in the conference room." After the gala, Cassandra had surprised me by asking to volunteer at the foundation, not as an executive or board member, but in the trenches, organizing food drives, visiting shelters, doing the unglamorous work she'd never considered before. "I'll be right there," I promised, gathering my files. As we walked down the hallway together, she asked, "Have you talked to Mom this week?" Diana and I were navigating a new relationship. Tentative, sometimes awkward, but honest in a way we'd never been before. She was in therapy now, confronting demons she'd carried for decades. "Yesterday," I nodded. "She's still nervous about speaking at the body image conference next month." "She'll do fine," Cassandra said. "It's important work." We entered the conference room where James waited with the board members. He smiled when he saw me, his eyes dropping briefly to my growing baby bump, our first child due in 3 months. "Ready to begin?" he asked. I took my seat at the head of the table, no longer defined by my mother's expectations or my sister's shadow. The revenge I'd once craved had transformed into something far more powerful. Genuine change. The scars from my wedding day hadn't disappeared completely. There were still moments when those cruel words echoed in my mind, but they no longer defined me. "Yes," I said, opening my folder. "I'm ready." What I'd learned in these 6 months was that true revenge wasn't about making others suffer. It was about refusing to let their cruelty determine my worth. It was about building something meaningful from the ashes of pain. And as I looked around at the life I was creating, the foundation doing real good, my marriage to a man who loved me exactly as I was, the child growing inside me who would never know the sting of body shame from those who should love them most, I knew I had succeeded.